Tuesday, everyone. We're super excited to be joined today by Ted, who runs Case and is the former CTO of GitHub. Super excited to have him today. I think one of the leaders and visionaries today within how AI is shaping DevOps and that world. I don't know, Ted, if you want to do a quick introduction about yourself and the quick elevator pitch for Case.
Sure, yeah. I'm Ted. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so my background is in developer tools for a long time, let's say. I don't want to age myself too much. I used to be a systems engineer and then VP of Eng and then CTO at GitHub for a long time. This was during a lot of our sort of like hyper growth period when we were going from a couple of million repositories to 100 million, like that. Before that, I was actually worked at a company called Bank Simple. We were like one of the first neobanks where we actually did some interesting early. We didn't even call it AI. It was just, ML. I don't even think we called it that. Just, things like that. And then recently started Case with my co-founder, Ben. He also worked at GitHub for a long time. And we've been focused on AI developer tools, but specifically for the DevOps lifecycle. So less about coding and more about what happens after things go to production. So helping people do a lot of the things that you traditionally, the DevOps teams focus on, things like infrastructure as code, areas like, for example, detecting infrastructure drift, figuring out cost savings in your AWS infrastructure, figuring out anomalies, looking at logs. So sort of all the classic sort of day-to-day DevOps work where things like pattern recognition, correlation analysis, and a lot of things, even just simple stuff like LL analysis and summary can really help. So we've been building that for a little bit. We're really passionate about, I think, how we can get the building blocks of developer tools in the AI era more available. So we also spend a lot of time on open source products. We recently released Kit, which is sort of a building block Python toolkit for doing that. So in addition to sort of building our own product, I think this is a really interesting time for developers. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the stuff going on there. But I think a really interesting time for how we're going to see developer tools evolve. And we'd like to play a role in shaping a lot of that.
Yep, super exciting. And I'm actually really curious to understand a little bit from you. How did you decide to leave? Why did you think now was an interesting time, particularly within everything else that is going on with AI? How did you know that you wanted to leave GitHub?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the way I think there are different, I mean, this is the classic like business wave thing, right? Like every once in a while, there's something that's like pretty obviously going to change things a lot. I think, obviously the first wave of SaaS was that where all of a sudden, you could grow a business by offering software that wasn't built in-house and you could scale it that way. Mobile was obviously another one. I think we started to realize a couple of years ago that it was pretty obvious that when it was, I mean, I guess it was sort of, obviously it was the ChatGPT moment for everyone, right? Where, this is actually real. And I was actually taken by surprise. I was like pretty skeptical about certainly about large language models. But it was pretty obvious that a few years ago that, okay, this was going to be real. And then the bet that I think is a good bet is if this is happening, and pretty much for software development, which is I think the perfect spot for using certainly large language models and many other kinds of ML, that this was going to change sort of the whole field in a way that maybe was larger even than anything that happened in the GitHub era, right? And I think we're starting to see that. I think we decided to pick maybe the hardest area, which is the DevOps part of it, the infrastructure part. And I think partly just, I always had a background in infrastructure. We thought there'd be a lot of opportunity. We knew it would take a little bit of time to build, which is sort of what we've been working on for a while. But yeah, I think, every once in a while you see a sort of sea change in how software is built. This seems so far to be even larger than any of the ones we've seen in the last years. So I think we just had to be a part of it.
Yep. I mean, there's definitely been a sea change. I studied computer science. I'm a software engineer by training. And I've been playing around with the vibe coding and it is actually kind of crazy. It can generate a massive amount of code. I don't know about the quality of the code. The quality of the code is sometimes questionable, but I think to your point, it's like the volume of code that can now be generated is immense. And so what happens is now the bottleneck might be everything downstream. It's not the code generation anymore. It's the CI/CD, it's the deployment pipelines, and all of that QA that goes on behind the scenes in the infrastructure. So I'm actually really curious, how have you seen DevOps shift? How do you think it will shift given everything we're seeing on the AI coding side?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So, I mean, the clicking on the keyboard is like the least interesting part now. I mean, it was arguably always the least interesting part, but I think we always thought it was, I used to think it was interesting. I think it's been a very humbling experience for a lot of us to see that, wow, to see the machine do what we, used to take me days or, weeks to do. Like you said, the quality maybe not as good, but it's certainly not getting any, it's going to get better over time. And, there's obviously ways of the quality better. Some of the stuff we're doing around that and with context. So, but yeah, I mean, I think just the raw generation of code is certainly not really the bottleneck anymore. I talk to like a lot of startup founders, the 2-3 engineers, and they're putting out more code than you would have been able to do with 100 engineers, right? Yeah, we'll see how the quality is over time, but the volume of it is not really the issue. So the issues now become all of the real traditional stuff that makes software development hard, right? Like you said, deployment is still challenging. You can't really vibe code a deployment yet. Testing is, you can generate a lot of tests, but testing, that actually is where you maybe need to make sure your tests are good. Infrastructure management is still going to be really hard. Large scale systems design is still really hard. Infrastructure design, scaling is still really, really hard, right? Like even if, for example, an LLM is really, really good at telling you like how to scale something like that, there's still real work to be done there. I think, a lot of the first generation of some of the tools that we've seen that have been trying to do AI assisted DevOps, the general response has been like, increase the size of your RDS instance. And it's like, well, sure. That's the guess. That's sure. But buy a larger hard disk, sure. I mean, yes. The more interesting things are optimizations, right? How do I do that given constraints? These things are hard. LLMs, to some extent, they're kinds of AI, other kinds of machine learning are going to help more here. I think one of the places where people are really, really struggling still, and I think everyone's sort of aware of this and are still working on it, is, you can write a lot of code, or certainly like if people who don't have a technical background are writing a lot of code, you still have to get that somewhere. It still needs to go somewhere. And so some of these platforms we're seeing are already starting to incorporate some of the infrastructure side. I think one of the reasons, for example, like a platform like Lovable, which has I think a fairly non-technical audience, took off so quickly, was that it provided that infrastructure immediately. So you didn't really need to know anything about a database. I think one of the things we're going to start seeing over the rest of this year, as a lot of these sort of AI created apps grow, is you're going to hit the traditional scaling challenges. You did not design, not you, but the builders of the software probably were not building with the intention of scalability. And so, yeah, how do you help people do that? So a lot of our customers are fast growing companies that are like, well, look, we don't necessarily want to build out a huge amount of DevOps work right now, but we need to do something. And so they're already accustomed to the idea of using AI to build their products. So the next logical thought is, well, maybe we can use AI to scale it. That is a more difficult technical challenge for a number of reasons, and I think we're sort of hard at work at figuring out how to make that easy for people.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think the craziest thing about Lovable and folks like that is, one thing I've been thinking actually about those platforms is that they actually steer you toward using something. So if the default, for example, might be Supabase, or the default might
Yeah.
actually be Fly, and that's kind of default what you get funneled into, which I think
Yeah.
is good because it's like there's uniformity in, what the DevOps stack they kind of give you by default is. But then to your point, it's like, what do you do after that? Does that actually scale
Yeah.
the way that you want it to, and from a cost standpoint, the way
Yeah.
that you want it to? And it's very different to be building an app that is just, vibe coded for your mom versus an enterprise deployment or actual enterprise
Sure.
software solution.
I think that's right.
And I think, by the way, maybe like deployment is also becoming more complicated because you're supporting SaaS, you might be supporting single tenant BYOC, you might be supporting on-prem. Are you seeing that complexity increase as well in terms of deployment?
Yeah, I think so. So I think there are a few things that are happening here that are definitely pretty interesting. So first, to your point about sort of the way there's sort of a lot of these platforms are steering people, I think that's been useful. You've also seen it reflected in the growth of some of these companies. This number of Supabase databases has increased rapidly. That's largely attributable to the amount of new projects that are just getting a default Supabase repo. And I think that'll have some interesting, I don't know, not to be too much a prognosticator. I think they'll have some interesting dynamics as to how much you're able to convert those into paying customers. Right? But yeah, I think so. A few things in I think the deployment set that are interesting. The main platform for the last 8 to 10, 8-ish years, for large scale stuff has been Kubernetes. Kubernetes is still, I think, the right option for a lot of types of deployments, but that it's still a complicated piece of infrastructure to run. And I can tell you that most of the new vibe coded apps are not running Kubernetes infrastructure. And I think, I talk to a lot of folks that are not really even thinking about this sort of thing. So I think partly some of that is already changing. There is still, as you said, a longer term trend, which is the variety of deployments, like there's been a lot of interest in this sort of, the term I hear a lot is cloud prem, which is an idea of running your infrastructure, let's call it the control plane, maybe in your own cloud, and then running the data plane or maybe the databases themselves in a customer infrastructure. This seems to be growing. This is maybe independently of the AI trend, but it's been growing a lot. Part of the reason I think that's been growing, or part of the reason there's interest in that is, again, and this does tie into the AI trend, is people are the velocity of shipping applications pretty high right now.
Yep.
And so, the traditional, like the GitHub Enterprise in the old days, we would ship an enterprise version, I don't know, once a quarter, right? And so the enterprise, this is the on-prem version. The on-prem version was always way behind the .com version. That was never fun. It was also really hard to debug. So you are seeing these sort of like hybrid deployment models. I think that's going to continue. That creates a lot of complexity for app builders who are trying to basically not really even think about this. And so I think, you do see some companies that are working on this. Replicated's been working on this for a long time. I think have some interesting solutions. We're trying to help people, at least in some of their deployment flows, with how they work with GitHub Actions. But I think that's an interesting development, and I don't think that's gonna get less complicated over time.
Yep. Yeah. I think a lot of it, by the way, is driven by folks are realizing that their data is kind of the lifeblood of their
Yeah.
company. And so they don't want that leaving whatever VPC they have. And so we've been seeing a lot more demand for that as well. Folks trying to host, so like hosted SaaS within their customers' VPC. And those deployments, to your point, are just gnarly because you could be managing like different versions and different customer VPCs. It is like truly a nightmare
Yeah.
on the upgrade side and everything else. I actually am curious. I'm actually curious. I have a hypothesis that because OpenAI aligned themselves originally with Microsoft, it actually caused a lot more enterprises to actually become
Yeah.
multi-cloud. I don't know if that's like, if you've seen that or you think that's kind of accurate
I
too, but
heard that.
I'm
Yeah, so
curious.
there's like weird.
Because multi-cloud used to be just like, oh, like, are people actually multi-cloud or just something people are saying?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional joke of multi-cloud was like no one really. There's a kind of a made-up thing, right? Like everyone was on their multi-cloud journey, right, which was a indefinitely long journey type thing. I do think so. I have seen, for example, like even with OpenAI deployments, there were a lot of folks that were like, we have a mix of, like, for example, we were using OpenAI in, not we, but other companies in Azure, or we were using it also in the OpenAI's cloud. I think the weird thing about multi-cloud that's happened is like, it's not so much that you're running all of your infrastructure, but you might be like wanting to run inference or training in particular places. Another weird one is startups getting, and not just startups, getting credits into, this is traditional, but specifically for AI, getting AI credits. So I know a lot of early stage startups that are running multi-cloud because they're trying to maximize where their AI spend is going. So obviously that's maybe more of a startup optimization, but still interesting. So I think you do see some of that, but for maybe unexpected reasons than you would have.
Yeah. Well, that's one way to do it. Cool. I mean, I'd love to chat through some of your new product
Yeah.
launches. I know you have a couple open source projects that you guys released recently, which are super exciting. Maybe you can walk us through some of those, Kit and others.
Yeah. Love to talk. So Kit, I'm really excited about Kit. I mentioned it earlier. The origin of Kit is, so we do a lot of, part of our product is we generate a lot of pull requests, right? So if you're, we do an analysis of your Terraform code, infrastructure as code, and we see that, I don't know, you've got an RDS instance that's unencrypted, right? So there are two ways of solving this. One would be to make a direct change to AWS, right? Like make an RDS API call and fix it, which, in the case of an emergency is fine. But the correct way to do this, of course, is to go to your Terraform or whatever you're using, Pulumi, and update that, right? So when we detect issues in your infrastructure as code, we open pull requests to the customer's infrastructure as code repo, right? So Case does that. This does two good things. One is it keeps your infrastructure as code there, right? One of the major problems that people have is what's called infrastructure drift, where your actual infrastructure does no longer mirrors or it goes pretty far away from your actual infrastructure as code. We also help with that. So we have a feature in our agent that will detect that and bring these things back in line. But to make a long story short, the idea here is that we're trying to keep your infrastructure secure, relatively inexpensive compared to what maybe defaults would be, as well as preventing drift. So anyway, in order to do that, we have to open pull requests into your Terraform repo. Now, everyone, this is partly due to the complexity of Terraform, but also partly due to the fact that best practices never seem to really get standard. Everyone seems to have very, very different sorts of infrastructure as code setups, to say the least, where you've got modules here, you've got just, everyone's got something different. I don't judge anyone's infrastructure as code. Some are different. Ours, we have issues with, but they're all very different. So we had to build a lot of sort of like code intelligence to be able to sort through repositories and figure out if we're going to make a change to your infrastructure as code, where do we do that? So we had to find, okay, well, if we're going to update an RDS instance, let's find, we have to find where is the RDS instance defined? Is there a module? Are the variables in some other file? So we needed to build all this content. So we ended up building ourselves. And unfortunately, there really weren't a lot, there isn't a lot of open source. There wasn't like a proper open source toolkit or library to do this, right? So if you look at like every IDE or what a lot of these even open source tools do, open source, editor type tools, they need some sort of like code search primitives, semantic search primitives, chunking primitives, file reading primitives. If you use like Cursor, Windsurf, whatever, you'll see on the right hand side, it's like doing stuff. It's like running search or running grep. So those tools I always wanted to be able, for anyone who's building AI dev tools like us, to be able to have tools available to that. So we wrote Kit, we extracted Kit from a lot of our existing code base and then wrote additional stuff. We MIT licensed it. We released it just a couple weeks ago, less than that. And that exposes a bunch of primitives. I can show, maybe if I can share, like, if I can see it, my Claude here. I can show a little bit of sort of some of the stuff here and how this kind of works. So let's see. Okay, cool. So I am in Claude. This is Claude Desktop. And so if you look here at the very top, what we've done is we have like Kit is now here as an MCP. We haven't talked about MCP yet, but we have Kit is now exposed as an MCP tool. And so the long story short of what that means is some of Kit's functionality, like open repository, these are tools or resources that Kit exposes, can be exposed here into any tool. In this case, it's Claude Desktop, and it could be your app, it could be like your server, it could be your agent. And by giving just a little bit of help here, Claude figures out, well, let me invoke some of the tools, in this case, get file tree, that Kit, our toolkit, exposes. And there are various things you can do. For example, you can search code. So what Claude is doing is it's using its LLM tool calling ability to try to figure out what's going on in this repo, right? But we can ask questions like, for example, where is user class defined, right? This is something you can do, obviously, in Cursor or Windsurf, but in those cases, Cursor and Windsurf is calling its own version of this search code, right? If you're building your own AI dev tools, you can use Kit to actually search code, call these things, have your own functions, right? And then Kit will Claude Code here will keep doing this, keep making tool calls here to figure stuff out, and then it's able to actually summarize pretty nicely here what this user class is, what it does. It's able to give summaries here. And this is just by invoking a lot of the functions that Kit provides. Right? And so the idea of Kit is you can build, I guess in theory, I don't know if you could build all of Case, but you could build some of it, is you could build your own AI dev tools using these primitives and using these open source tools. So that's the big sort of vision of Kit. And we've been pretty excited about it. It's been taking off. A lot of folks that are building code reviewers, for example, are using this. This is just a simple demonstration of it. You can imagine in your own application or agent how you might be able to use some of these sort of functions. Searching, chunking, and getting sort of explanations. You can do a file tree. So for example, I could say, give me a file tree of this repo. This is something, again, that you would want to provide to your LLM as helping your LLM, for example, answer questions. So here's a file tree of the repository. So say I'm building an AI dev tool and I want to improve the context that I'm sending along to the LLM when I'm asking it to generate code. So here we now have this. So I could ask, for example, if the LLM is going to generate a change, I could be like, well, where should we add the new diff for auth code or something like that? And well, I misspelled add, but it figured out that I meant add. And here it's able to intelligently figure out where this stuff would go, right? So if you're building, again, a dev tool, you can use all of these things. So that's a little hint or a little preview of what Kit can do. You can imagine how we use this specifically for the DevOps analysis that we do, where we're looking through different repositories. But we're pretty excited about what we can do with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is actually super cool. I have been vibe coding, and I think one of the things that Cursor actually does very poorly is it writes a lot of duplicate code. So you're
Yeah,
like, why did you write two separate implementations of this thing? And then you have to go back and refactor all of the code. And I think over time that will get a lot better, but
yeah,
it's with tools like these that are able to like intelligently grok what's going on within a repo really, really quickly and surface that type of information to the LM. I think it's really exciting. And so how did you guys decide to open source this, or what is the strategy behind open sourcing, and how did you guys think about that maybe philosophically as a company?
yeah.
We were talking separately with a founder last week. His platform right now is closed, and he was curious, like, should I be thinking about open source? And so I was curious how you guys made that decision.
Yeah, so this is an all. I mean, this is maybe it's actually fairly philosophical kind of belief thing with me. I think in developer tools specifically, developer tools should generally, the primitives, not necessarily the products, although they can be too, but the primitives should absolutely be open source, I think, in developer tools. Even GitHub, I mean, story, like tell an old story, like with GitHub, like GitHub we open sourced almost all of the core stuff that we use to build GitHub, right? So the Ruby interface to Git that we had, and a bunch of other stuff. And in fact, I don't know how much this is known, but like GitLab's first year or two was built entirely on GitHub infrastructure, right? Or GitHub stack, where they took all those libraries. And I think that was a great thing, right? Like GitHub did fine, GitLab did great. So I generally don't think that the underlying primitives in developer tools need to be closed source. I think you may want to build a full product that adds UX. Maybe that is some of your secret sauce, but but I think certainly at the very least, the underpinnings of this should be open source. From a business standpoint, I think it's important for us. I mean, we're our audience, our people are developers, right? So you connect with developers through generally open source and through working with them. I think the most exciting thing for us is if we have contributors to Kit who also maybe happen to want to use some of our real in the rest of our product. That's great. But I think that especially as we're approaching this sort of AI dev tools era, I think we maybe started. Weirdly, I think a fair bit of the early days of AI dev tools have been closed source. I'm not quite sure why, more so than I would have thought. And so I think I'm mostly just looking back at what worked in the past. And I just think we as an industry, maybe this is a little as a hot take or not, but like I think industry wise, we should really be encouraging more of it. I mean, you just saw 2 days ago, or was it a day ago, yesterday? Microsoft basically is going to open source all of Copilot, right? So if they can do that, certainly others can, right? I think just VS Code's been open source for a while, which of course is why Cursor and Windsurf exist. If it wasn't for that, they would never have been able to start. But Copilot itself, the extension, has been closed source. And in fact, I think this is a little off topic, but relevant. I think one of the hindrances or one of the things that even gave Cursor and Windsurf the opportunity to come in was VS Code and Copilot. The integration there was kind of a little off, right? Because you could use VS Code without Copilot. The integration was a little clunky. Even the teams were separate, right? So I think what's happening now is basically, I think, at least so far as Microsoft said, Copilot is just going to be fully integrated into VS Code, and it's just going to release one single AI-oriented code editor, right? Which is, kind of like, weird to say, an open source Cursor, kind of weird inversion of the flow, but that's basically what it's going to be.
Yep. Yeah.
I think it's very compelling to me.
I'm so curious about that strategy. I mean, I think part of it is like, hey, I just want to support the ecosystem. And I think these types of fundamental building blocks should be open source. And it's more of an ethos philosophical thing. But I do think, with Meta open sourcing Llama and Microsoft making this really big move to open source basically all of Copilot, as you mentioned, I think it's so interesting because it's almost like if the incumbents are basically saying, if I see value accruing in a different layer, I'll actually just open source it to try to commoditize that layer. So that's like the other way of looking at it, which is maybe a little bit more capitalistic and a little bit more self-serving. But like if I release open source versions of this, basically I reduce the value that can accrue to that layer of the stack.
That is 100% accurate, I think. And of course, Microsoft can always, I mean, this is an interesting thing. Like if you think about Microsoft Teams, for example, which obviously is tremendous in the enterprise, they could open source Teams, and I don't think it would have any negative effect. If anything, it might have a positive effect on their growth, right? Like it almost doesn't matter at the enterprise level. Enterprises are going to be paying for the services, they're going to be paying for all that other stuff. They want to pay. I mean, this is an interesting thing going back, speaking about GitHub, like GitLab, ironically, is an open source, not ironically, GitLab is fully open source. GitHub is not. But GitLab was the first to the enterprise, right? And that was in part because they were building a bunch of enterprise features that we weren't. It was also in part because they didn't necessarily have to serve. They could just go build enterprise stuff. We had to worry about the open source community, right? And sort of different needs. So we had to balance different stuff. But, I mean, HashiCorp is another great example where enterprises are often more comfortable with the open source solution. As long as you're providing the service layer on top, they can audit the code, they can make changes. I think what's almost sometimes ironic is that open source actually is often better into the enterprise than I think what might be, sort of simply assumed. So yeah, I think you're 100% right. And as you said, from a Microsoft perspective, yeah, they can drive down the cost of the editor. I think OpenAI, not to get too into the business stuff, but certainly like OpenAI's acquisition of Windsurf, which was a very large number, right? That wasn't they weren't buying that for the ARR necessarily, right? That in part allows them to, if they want, for example, they could drive down the cost of Windsurf down to, whatever it costs them to run those models. They could run it even lower. They could run it at a loss if they want. And that's very competitive to Cursor, right? Because if the Cursor and Windsurf are competitive and they're in similar products, the cheaper one could probably win. One other last interesting point, which occurred to me the other day, was right now, OpenAI or Windsurf uses you can use any number of models in Windsurf, right? And so one of the thoughts is, well, OpenAI is going to restrict, the Anthropic models or the Gemini models. I actually might think that if I'm Anthropic or Google, I might actually not want Windsurf/OpenAI to be able to even use my models in that because of the training data, right? So there's a weird inversion. Like you can almost imagine OpenAI/Windsurf losing some of those models for other reasons. They won't be able to use them externally. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's really interesting. I mean, the business, as you said, the business aspect is really, really interesting. But yeah, Microsoft's really making a play for it. They're going to try. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. It's like kind of a fascinating time right now. Cool. I mean, I'm curious, what are people building with Kit?
Yeah.
Where do you see folks innovating?
So code reviewers, I think, are an area where, there's an interest in generic code reviewers, but like if you're at a company and you want to build a code reviewer for your own specific code base or your own specific needs, like the Kit is really good for that, right? So companies I've been hearing about this before, but companies are building their own internal code reviewers, sometimes for security reasons or whatever, compliance reasons, but also because they want to like add customizations to them, right? So that's one where I think there's a lot of interest. Some people are just building their own sort of like individual CLI tools to understand their own code. So for example, you can use Kit sort of like I was demonstrating with Claude's desktop, and you can imagine building your own sort of like local CLI tool to like explore repos to understand stuff. You can use Kit to do pretty good documentation as well, because you can chunk code pretty well, pass it to the LLM and say like, explain this. So those sorts of things. I would love to see someone build like a small editor with it, but you could certainly do it. We're going to experiment here with building a little bit more of sort of an example code reviewer here to sort of show how you can use Kit's flow. But those are some of the initial things that are coming out. And of course, we use it extensively internally for both our code review aspects, I mentioned a lot of the code generation and a few other things as well.
Amazing. And I feel like this is actually one of the first use cases, by the way, of MCP that I've seen that I think is actually pretty useful. Like there are some less useful ones. Most of the use cases that we've seen so far have all been on the developer side,
Yeah.
aka I think most of that is because all of the MCP clients or the vast majority of the MCP clients are the AI code IDEs, so
Yeah.
Cursor and Windsurf, and that's why.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah, the interesting thing about it, I mean, so we hosted like a MCP hackathon actually about a month ago, and I think one of the judging criteria were, is this something that is uniquely useful to MCP, right? And I think a lot of the demos you see around MCP right now are not specifically MCP very interesting, right? They can be done very easily with the REST API. They can be done with a little bit of other kind of glue code. I think where MCP does get really, really interesting is if you're building sort of anything agent like and you just want to be able to bring in integrations, then it's interesting, right? Just sort of building, like if I could just have easily used the GitHub API in lieu of it, then it's not that interesting. So yeah, that's partly, I think, for us, it's like we know, as you said, people want to bring in code related tools into their flows. So that's kind of why we think it's interesting. Kit also has a REST API because I mean the idea is that these things are very, I think, different from MCP and REST. Sometimes are getting conflated in people's minds. They're very, very different in terms of the way that they understand state and all this stuff like that. But in any case, we ship a REST API as well, because if you want to access Kit from, say, I don't know, TypeScript or Go or whatever, you can do that over simply a REST API through your own code. So I think for Kit, we're mostly interested in how just sort of like being able to use it in any way you want. That's sort of the other goal.
Yep. Yeah. I was having a discussion with Jeremiah, who created the Fast MCP project, which was a really large open source repo on the MCP side. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that came up was like a lot of people are saying that MCP is like not really that different from tool calling or functions and the prior generation of like API. What do you think? Like, is there actually a use for it? Like, why do we need this thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing strictly that you can do with MCP that you couldn't have done by passing a JSON, a system prompt of a bunch of JSON and telling the model like, "Hey, come back with the tool call." Right? I mean, obviously there's more to it than that, but certainly what the core of what people are using MCP for is basically that, right? And I don't think there's anything very specific in MCP as a protocol that a huge breakthrough. But what I do think is the breakthrough, and by the way, I don't know in a year whether it's going to, MCP itself will come out with another version. Like protocols change very quickly, and they evolve, and there'll be competitors or whatever. I think where MCP, part of the reason I think it's taken off, and the reason that at least I think there's excitement around it, is that it's inverting a little bit of the traditional responsibility of integration, right? So if we, for example, like at Case, wanted to integrate with, I don't know, say Twilio or something like that, I'd go take the Twilio REST API and I would build an integration and I would have to figure out how it works. And that's still work, right? And traditionally, that kind of integration work has been very unpleasant to do. People don't like doing it. I mean, there's been companies over the years that have been like the integration hubs where use I forget the names. But
iPassive, yeah, the
yeah,
iPassive of the previous generation,
right. And so
like Workato or
yeah,
Zapier.
exactly right. And so now though, and it's subtle, and I'm not even quite sure I'm explaining it quite well yet. But if you're building software that by its nature is more like agent-like and relies on making LLM calls for most of its work, then it's very, very natural to just bring in, and it is a little magical, in another MCP server like Twilio, and all of a sudden, wow, my agent can make phone calls, right? So without me having to write any integration code on my side, right? So it inverts the responsibility where it's on Twilio or someone else who's building a Twilio MCP server to provide that to me. Now I just have to bring that in. And as long as I handle the configuration, all of a sudden, wow, my whatever agent I'm building now has phone calling superpowers, and I'm relying on the LLM to correctly invoke that when necessary, right? So that now makes it really much more interesting in terms of people who are building software to be able to add capabilities to their software. That's why it's exciting. I don't think there's anything specific in the protocol that's necessarily like, oh, this is a huge thing, but That, which is that, it allows me to very rapidly improve my own product. That's cool. And so I think like for us, like, and people who are using Kit, like say you're building an AI dev tool, well, bring in Kit, and all of a sudden your AI dev tool now has the ability to search and to chunk and to do these things that maybe it didn't before, right? And you, as the implementer, didn't really have to do anything. You just got these capabilities, you got this library. And that I think is pretty cool in the sense, of course, all of it is contingent on the fact that you're building a product that is using an LLM, right? Like it's not that interesting unless you are making LLM calls, but once you are and you're relying on the tool calling functionality of models, and we're believing that tool calling is getting better in the models, which it is, then that's exciting. So yeah, so I'm always very skeptical of kind of like there's obviously a lot of hype around this, a lot of misunderstanding of what it's for. But when you're thinking about that, I think that's very powerful. And I think that people who are correctly using it are seeing some benefits already. Again, I don't know whether it's MCP itself in 6 months, but something like that that allows providers of services to invert that process, I think is really.
Yep. Yeah. I'm not sure if you spent any time with like A to A or that protocol that Google launched for agent to
Yeah.
agent. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that, or is it competitive with MCP?
Yeah, it's a little
Does it
different.
coexist?
Yeah, I think they could coexist. I mean, like, I think they're definitely. So, I mean, I think the idea, so far as I understand it, with 8A is like I have a bunch of agents, perhaps over multiple providers or whatever, and I want them to kind of work together. Or if I'm an agent, I need to expose some metadata about what my capabilities are. That idea, I think, is actually pretty useful in the sense that we need to figure out, again, similar to traditional AP, like REST APIs, like how do I sort of self-document. There was this idea in real REST, which no one ever did, which is that REST APIs, are self-documenting, right? Like you'd never need to write a REST doc because you would follow links in the REST API, and that never really ended up happening. But if you really are like a REST purist, that's how you thought API should have been, right? So I think some of the ideas of A to A is around sort of discoverability of the capabilities of agents. There are some really interesting security aspects in there. I think probably everyone's been kind of running a little roughshod over what security around it MCP is going to look like, and not just security in terms of like actual cryptographic. I mean more like authentication and authorization, particularly around authorization, which is going to be a whole other interesting thing. I think there are going to be a lot of companies that are emerge around certainly agent authorization generally. But yeah, so they're certainly compatible. I would say that the hype or the excitement around A to A is much less than MCP right now. In part, I think because people aren't quite sure what to do with it yet, and also in part because I think it's actually more forward looking into this world of multi-agent collaboration that we don't really have yet. But everyone kind of knows, okay, well, if I'm building an agent that needs to use tools or needs to access some resources, like I can use MCP. So I do think something like A to A will probably be around. It is probably a little more forward thinking, a little more ambitious, not forward thinking, a little more forward looking. I think we'll see something like that, but they're definitely compatible. I wouldn't think of them as competitors. One thing I do think that's a good, very bullish for MCP, again, is like Microsoft yesterday, they announced that there's going to be like native MCP support in Windows, which is cool. Not necessarily, I mean, I think it'll enable some cool stuff. It's more important that Microsoft did not announce their own protocol. That's actually the most important thing. If Microsoft had said, here's the Microsoft version of it, that actually would have been bad. I think you don't want to split usage here. So I do think Microsoft 20 years ago or even 10 would have announced their own and tried to own it and control it, and they're not, which is good. MCP came from Anthropic, but if I ask most people, they don't even know where it emerged from anymore. I think Anthropic's done a really good job of not trying to over control it. It's pretty community oriented. I'm sure I'm not involved in the governance of it. I'm sure people who are closer will have complaints about governance, but everyone does. But it seems good enough. But the main thing is that people are not trying to fight MCP, and that's great. That was different than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when web standards emerged. There were years and years of trying to fight over that. It does seem like most companies have realized that you cannot trying to monetize and control the protocol doesn't work. That did not work in the first wave of web standards consistently. It didn't really work with cloud standards, right? Like that didn't really happen. And so it doesn't seem like people are trying to force it this time, which is great. More adoption, whether it's MCP or whatever ends up being the thing, as long as companies are not trying to wall off protocol adoption, that's really good. And so as long as these things stay open, I think that's going to be good for everyone.
Yep. Yeah. I agree with you that it's hard to monetize the protocol itself. What do you think are the monetization opportunities around MCP? I've heard of some folks who are like, we'll just host it for you, or we will help you convert your existing API to an MCP server. We'll manage observability. There's authentication component
Yeah,
of it that is, to your point, kind of interesting because there's almost like a spectrum. You could see the AI agent as a co-pilot that's piggybacking off of the human authentication. So it's like the username and password and of the human user, and it's just
yeah,
writing that session token, or there's kind of the API token of the world, and you treat it as like purely a non-human entity, aka it's purely a machine, which I think is the
yeah.
world we're going to, but we're kind of in this weird in between right now for the authentication layer.
I think that's right. I think for monetizing, with MCP and agents in general, I think security is absolutely the right place. If I was investing in that, that's probably where I would go. Both because security is security, and but also because like there's a lot to figure out here. I'm personally kind of skeptical around like sort of like MCP marketplacey type stuff. Like I think there's maybe room for something like that. There's been a couple of people who've been trying to like sell MCP servers. I don't think that's going to work. I think there's probably some room for a little bit of tooling around, like you said, hosting like a remote MCP server. I don't think that's necessarily huge. I definitely don't think there's a lot of room for helping people build MCP servers because I don't think it's that hard. Like it's actually pretty easy, and frankly, using LLMs to do it, as long as the LLMs have enough context about what MCP is, then yeah, it's not that hard to build. So I think I would actually think that dev tooling around the development of MCP dev tooling is probably not that interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of room for open source projects there. I don't think there's a lot of room to monetize it. I think the most valuable monetization of it is building products that make use of MCP stuff, right? That's where I think the monetization is making use of this. And then, yeah, I think probably offering security tooling, whether it's traditional, just security auditing tooling for is this MCP safe, right? Like there's someone should be doing that. Whether it's providing more the general questions around, what can this agent do? I mean, I think there's so much around, what is like RBAC for agents? Like, I don't even, like, I haven't even had time to even think deeply on this yet. I know people are, but that's going to be really, really important. Both, I mean, you're going to have this set of web agents that have certain things. You're going to have, more interestingly, the programmatic agents. That's where I think the most interesting monetization, but I also think the most interesting products are going to come out. So that's where I'd probably be looking.
Yep. Yeah. For your own architecture at Case, how agentic have you guys designed your systems?
Extremely agentic at this point. The journey of this is actually really interesting. The very first product we built, the very first sort of AI oriented product we built was it was a chat bot. It was in Slack that could answer questions about your infrastructure. We built this. That was the first thing we tried. It worked, let's say 44% of the time. This was the very early pre-MCP, this was the very, very beginning of like even function calling APIs, right? And the idea was good, but the models were way far from being able to even pick. If you gave, this was an era where if you gave 3 or 4 tool choices to the model, it was like, no, good luck, right?
Yep. And the context window was like nothing. It was like one page.
Yeah, it was really hard to build any. It was hard to build chatbots at that time, period. But certainly to build something where you would trust your infrastructure, right? And so we started to build a bunch of deterministic stuff, which is what we built mostly in the last year. Deterministic flows, for example, like our infrastructure drift tool, which is deterministic. What we realized in the last few months, and what we're rolling out now, was we could actually have the best of both worlds, right? Where you could start applying more of this sort of like, given a task, an agentic task in DevOps, do that. But here are some tools that we've built that are, more or less deterministic that you can trust. So it's really just the invoking of those tools, right? And once we're able to get fine-tuned models that are able to pick those tools correctly, we do a bunch of coordination around figuring out that, then it started to work. And so what we're rolling out now is essentially a full agent that allows you to state a goal and give it a bunch of sort of pretty complicated tools that we've built around handling traditional DevOps tasks. We're able to sort of coordinate those tools, right? What's cool for us is if you, for example, want to bring in, speaking of like MCP, if you have, say, an integration with a newer, let's say, observability platform, and they have an MCP tool, you can bring that into Case, and now all of a sudden, well, we have some context about what's going on in Grafana or in Honeycomb or whatever, right? So the quality of our suggestions are based on our own integrations, but now you can just plug in these sort of MCP things, and well, our product just gets better, right? I think that's where most people are starting to think about how they can, as I was mentioning earlier, how you can improve your own agents is like, well, make more tools available to them. Again, you have to do, we spend a lot of time looking at the security stuff, how we store credentials, like the hard parts are still in that glue. But once you sort of try to do that, I think it's there. I was really skeptical. I mean, like, maybe I don't know. I'm just maybe naturally skeptical of things, but like I was very skeptical even a year ago that like the agentic thing was going to be real. I was skeptical that it was anything more than a loop. It is real, and I think the benefits we're seeing are there as the models have improved. I mean, the truth is the models have gotten pretty good, right? And so the ability of models to invoke tools to accurately keep track of what they've done before is getting a lot better, and so the ability to actually do these agentic things, which has always been dependent on the models, is really becoming more and more real. So none of my bearish bets on AI have been correct in the last 3 years. So I'm continuing to believe. I'll update as the Bayesians say as things go. But right now, yeah, I think all the current indications are that doing the agentic flows are real, and that we're going to see more and more of this. Nothing is nothing the indication yet that it's not going to work yet. We'll see in a few months, but so far that I'm very bullish on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is a slow path, by the way, to getting AGI pilled.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
a
not
slippery
there yet.
slope.
I'm not there yet. Like I know I'm sure I'll be saying, yeah, I may be saying in a year. Well, it was obvious, I may be a little resistant there. I don't know. Maybe too much of a philosophy background to accept. I don't know, but yes, I agree. Right. The next obvious, logical leap once you get more confidence, is like, oh well, it's 2 or 3 more steps, and well, there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know.
Did you guys build it with any of the agent frameworks, like Chain or Llama Index? I guess you guys were way too early for that. But I think it's interesting because the that state machine version of the world. So I like what LangGraph did was, they actually took the DAG configuration and they were like, oh, like
Yeah.
actually we'll make it cyclic and it's amazing. And we'll like use the scaffolding to tell the AI agent where they are. But
Yeah.
someone was like, hey, like if the models get smarter, do they even need the scaffolding? Like we had the state machine there because the model was not smart enough to know where it was in the process.
Right.
And then if the models are smart, then it's almost like an implementation detail. You
Yeah.
could give the models tools, and if they know how to do it, they'll do it. And did you even need the state machine at all?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know what you think about that.
I
That
agree.
might be too AGI pilled for you.
No, it's not. No, I'm willing to believe. I actually believe that. I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, there's a funny. I mean, one way of thinking about like LangChain specifically. I mean, you'll remember like LangChain's original thing was, OpenAI. Or I guess it was the GPT. Yeah, GPT-3 API didn't have a conversation API yet. It was just the original API. So like you literally needed something to just keep track of the history of a conversation, right? Like it didn't. So you couldn't even do basic conversations. And the tradition, exactly the history of this has been the models have gotten better, and you need less and less scaffolding in your tooling around it, right? I think where you're seeing the current agent frameworks is around something that the models are not yet good at, which is like multi-agent stuff, which we do some of, right? We have like our own like small, it's like a very, very small internal, I guess, equivalent of like a LangChain or AG2 or something like that. But yeah, once models have a built-in multi-agent type thing, then you're not going to need scaffolding around multi-agent flows either, right? So yeah, I think the more everything's just going towards the models, and so yeah, I think that's, and I wouldn't be surprised, and we'll see like what. GPT-5 sounds like it's going to be an assemblage of all the models with some intelligent routing layer. Presumably, that routing layer has some understanding of tools. The model companies are really smart, right? And they know they want to move everything as much as they can to the model layer. And ideally, they have some special, if they have some kind of special sauce type thing that it's like, well, this is the better agentic one, whatever. So I wouldn't bet against any of the model companies on any of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think Anthropic is very much of the mindset that like everything is model. Like even if you look at model context protocol, the way it was set up with the clients and the servers, it's like you just have to feed information into the model. We don't need like
Yeah,
external agents or anything like that. And also with something like Claude Code, where it's literally just like, here is a
yeah,
CLI tool, like
yeah.
no UI, that's it.
Yeah,
It's kind of
I
simple.
like
It's beautiful.
I mean, I'm an old terminal user, so I really like Cloud Code. Yeah, I mean, I think you also see this in kind of the diminishing interest in sort of like prompt engineering. Right? This was 2 years ago. You were spending tremendous time iterating on prompts and over indexing. Now it's like in the future, it's just like here's a bunch of context and figure out what I'm trying to do. And, I don't know, like when models get better, like even when I'm using, let's say, like a Cursor or Windsurf, one of the things I do a lot, partly just out of curiosity, is I'll be like, here's a file that I'm working on. I just built this. Like literally, like what do you think I'm about to ask you to do? So not that's like a crazy problem. So I'm not even directing it. And I don't know, like the better models nowadays can usually intuit based on just seeing code what a logical next step would be, right? And that doesn't work all the time, but that's a concept that 2 years ago the models would have been nowhere. And now, in like a thinking model like O3 can look at like a bunch of code and be like, oh yeah, well the next thing they're going to want to do is add UI, or they're maybe going to want to extract, and that's again the same idea of just throw a bunch of things in the model and you're going to get something good out. Yeah, I would not not bet against that right now. So yeah, I think that's right.
Yep. Cool. I mean, I have so many other questions for you, but I think for the sake of time, and thank you so much for spending this time. It's so interesting to get all of your thoughts. I feel like you're really at the frontier of everything that's going on. And so I feel like we've had just a delightful conversation across so many different topics, and I don't want it to end. But what are you excited about for Case
Yeah.
next,
Yeah.
and just in general in AI in the DevOps world?
Yeah. So for Case right now, so we're rolling out. So this latest iteration of this pure agent that I'm talking about, really, it works better than I thought it would, I guess, which is delightful. Better than I would have expected even a year ago, right? The quality of what we're able to do is really cool. So I'm really excited about that. As what some of the like features that are pretty cool in it that we're doing are, literally like bringing up new infrastructure. I'll talk to a lot of like I was talking to a full stack engineer the other day, and they were basically saying, look, like I don't really want to write Terraform, right? I don't really understand it. I don't really know how to structure the Terraform. Can you just do that for me, right? And I think that's like that's a use case for us that's, I think, pretty cool. I think that traditionally in DevOps, when that problem has been around, the solution has been like, we need to write a new configuration language or something like, or, back in the day, when people were upset with Chef because it wasn't deterministic enough, it was like, well, let's write Puppet. Then when Puppet became too complicated, I really don't like configuration language. It's never been interested in mine. So Case being able to maybe help with that is cool. And so I think I'm very excited about that. In AI generally, I mean, this is a little separate from what we're talking about, but I'm actually super excited about like just multimodal models as they get better. Partly because I think even this is just in the DevTools world, but being able to do really interesting stuff with front end development when you have a very good vision model is really cool. For example, I'll give an example just even in our own development flows. You can imagine a designer mocking something up in whatever tool they're using, Figma, let's say. Figma. I still like Figma despite all the doubters recently. But you can mock something up, feed that directly over an MCP server or something to Windsurf Cursor, and the React components come out right pretty nicely. That's pretty cool. I'm sure there are React developers who would say, well, the code's going to be terrible. It might be terrible the first iteration, but again, I don't think it's going to get any worse. So I'm really excited about that. I think that could be really an interesting breakthrough in terms of, again, how quickly you could run sort of, again, how quickly you can turn things around, increase the iteration cycle.
But also on the testing side, by the
Yeah,
way, because a lot of the problem is on device testing, or I want to
yeah,
actually see what the UI looks like, and those are slightly non-deterministic slash can I even press the
yeah,
button? And Replit does some of this actually. Like I've seen
yeah,
it rules like screenshot the local host or whatever. And so I think they're all moving in that direction. They're not using the screenshot yet,
yeah,
but I think all of these platforms is going to start. Here's a screenshot, and then now can I put it into a visual
yeah.
um, LLM and have that then iterate on whatever it needs to do next?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. And I mean, end-to-end testing as well, right? Like, smoke testing, right? How many flows you have to explore, all of that, I think that's only going to get better. Some of the vision models that will be able to kind of explore your app are going to be really cool. Another related thing, and I know some people are working on this, is documentation. Like, I have always wanted a product. This is like a dream product for me. If someone builds this, I'll pay you whatever you want for it. Just like go through the product and do demo videos of the current state of the product for every single feature and push that into documentation, right? That seems technically pretty close, but that's a type of thing where, I mean, one of the great annoyances of running a SaaS product at scale is keeping documentation both up to date, but also like generating meaningful like demo videos. If that can be automated, that's a huge breakthrough. I don't see why it can't. So those sorts of things, I think, obviously the dev tool stuff is super interesting, but I'm really interested in Case is doing some of this in all of the other stuff that's around developing software, where I think there's probably going to be a bit more attention, over the next couple of years as we start looking at, assuming that the core coding models continue to get better, and looking the entire software development lifecycle. And that's where, again, Case is we're trying to play in the infrastructure DevOps part of that, but there's so much that goes into building software that's more than coding, and I think that's where I think most of for me, I think that's what I'm most excited about.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Ted. It's been just an absolute pleasure to be able to pick your brain, and super excited for Cased and all of the new launches. Go check it out. Their open source repo, Kit, and Cased AI for DevOps.
thank you so much.